I'm Bersabel, and my topic will be African and African American racial identity and cultural appropriation. Okay, so um, essentially, in this video explainer, I will use the controversy surrounding the South African music artist Tyla to explore the nuances of racial identity from both an African and African American perspective. I'll also examine the differences between cultural appreciation and appropriation between these groups. I will argue that Tyla's racial identity has cannot be encompassed nor limited by specific terminology, and that expressing her cultural identity cannot be considered appropriation. I will suggest that there is no binary definition of Blackness and that there are that the differences between African and African American identities provide cultural richness instead. Okay, so I chose this topic specifically because of my own experience with both African and African American culture, growing up in both the US and Ethiopia. And as cultural identity is in both these cultures are very unique, and while there are multiple cultural overlaps, there are also differences that lead to debate surrounding appropriation. This is specifically seen with the US audience's response to Tyla, a rising South African music artist. There's recently been a very large controversy in the US surrounding Tyla's racial identity as she defines herself as colored, which is a term that is perceived differently in South Africa than it is in the United States, which has often led to some cultural clashes and misunderstandings surrounding cultural appropriation and race identity. Okay, so reviewing of sources. So before we begin this discussion, it's important to have a clear understanding of the terms African and African American. In his essay, African, Gaines describes the history of the term African as both a source of identity and a mark of inferiority for people of African descent in America. However, with the eventual decolonization of Africa, we could see the stigma begin to disappear amongst African Americans and the term African begin to be reclaimed and redefined by Black Americans. This highlights the ever evolving definitions of African and African American identity and how they're constantly being influenced by historical, political, and cultural shifts. In a South African context, African or simply race identity has multiple definitions. One such definition is the term colored. In this context, colored refers to people of mixed race ancestry, including European, African, and Asian heritage. Despite its origins in racial segregation, colored is an official race identity in South Africa, recognized in the country's political and cultural institutions. The term is also associated with pride amongst South Africans. However, there's a completely different connotation in the term in an African American context. In the US, colored is considered outdated and offensive and is strongly associated with racial segregation and discrimination. African Americans have fought against the use of the term colored in the pursuit of their civil rights and equality. Because of these significant cultural gaps, as an African, Tyla does not view herself as Black, while African Americans do not view her as colored. Both these terms are valid descriptors of racial identity. However, the differing historical and cultural contexts of these definitions have created serious cultural clashes for Tyla. However, this does not diminish Tyla's blackness or racial identity, but rather demonstrates how race is celebrated differently in different contexts, and that blackness doesn't have one definition. This intricate relationship between African and African American identity is further demonstrated in Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun. This is specifically seen with Benitha and Assagai, as Assagai is a true African who's completely connected to his African heritage, and while Benitha is not as connected, and Assagai encourages her to connect more to her African roots. In the scene represented here on screen, we can see Benitha is dressed in Nigerian cultural clothing and dancing to African music. The character Assagai provides a different perspective to Benitha's racial identity here and how she connects with being a Black American and her African ancestry. However, because of the inherent differences between African and African American culture, cultural appreciation can often be mistaken for appropriation. As we may see this as appreciation, as with Benitha is dancing and dressed in traditional Nigerian attire. The same sense of appreciation can be mistaken for appropriation with seen as the controversy surrounding Tyla's introduction to a US audience. Because she identifies herself as colored, a large number of her African American audience considers her use of box braids and bantu knots as cultural appropriation due to the integral nature of hair in Black American history and culture. However, when examining the nameplate necklace video explainer discussed in class, it explains how the significance of cultural appropriation in an American context, and specifically how the evolution of the nameplate necklaces and how it became an important part of Black American culture in the US. However, when those outside the community wear these nameplates without recognizing its cultural significance, that's when cultural appropriation begins to occur. In this case, Tyla choosing to style her hair similarly to Black Americans and also her fellow Africans cannot be considered cultural appropriation as it is significant to her both in an African and an African American context, and it's something that is part of her racial identity, regardless of where she is. Now, looking at now and analyzing what has been said, when we look at the significance to African American history, exploring the evolving definitions and perceptions of racial identity, particularly in relation to terms like African and colored, helps to deepen our understanding of how Africans and African Americans have navigated their identity in the context of historical and cultural and societal pressures. It also sheds light on how complex racial identity is and how it's formed and how it intersects with both culture and history. Like and moving on to historical and cultural significance, historical context of terms like colored and their association with racial segregation in the US is crucial for understanding the legacy of systemic racism in African American history. But it also highlights the cultural differences and nuances of racial identity, as the same term colored and Black have different meanings depending on which part of the world you're in, and their significance is also different. As we can see how African Americans and Africans have grappled with their racial identity in the face of historical oppression, and how regardless of these different histories and discriminations, they have sought to reclaim and redefine their heritage. This cultural significance extends beyond terminology and speaks to a broader idea of racial identity and cultural pride, further demonstrating how there is no one definition of Black or colored, and there are no limits to one's racial identity. It's also important to recognize the boundaries between cultural exchange and between Africans and African Americans, as there's a deep trove of shared culture and experience. So therefore, saying that one group is appropriating the other diminishes the unique cultural significance of each group's history. In conclusion, Tyla identifying herself as colored demonstrates the dynamic nature of racial identity and its important and its relationship to history and culture to both history and cultural significance. In both an African American context, she's not limited by how she defines herself, and her perceived Blackness or lack thereof should not continue to confine how she expresses her racial identity. Ultimately, Tyla's choice to style her hair in a way that resonates with both Africans and African Americans cannot be considered appropriation, as it is her own racial identity. This demonstrates the fluidity and complexity as racial identity, as I stated before. Therefore, as we continue to navigate these complexities, it's essential to recognize and respect the diverse ways people define and express their race. Bibliography. Thank you.